Imagine throwing a simple neighborhood barbecue, only for it to be interrupted by flashing lights and sirens, called by none other than your own neighbor. Sounds outrageous, right? Well, that's exactly what happened when a seemingly quiet suburban street turned into the scene of an unexpected clash. But here's the twist. The person who made the call had no idea she'd just summoned the very man who would change everything, the new police chief and father of the family she'd tried to silence. This isn't just a story about a barbecue gone wrong. It's about the subtle yet powerful forces of prejudice that can still live in our communities today, and how one family's courage to rise above it sparked a reawakening no one saw coming. Have you ever faced a moment where you realize the way the world sees you doesn't align with who you truly are? In this story, that moment is amplified tenfold. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. When the Brown family finally arrived at their new home, the quietness of the street welcomed them with a mix of anticipation and challenge. James, the newly appointed police chief, parked the car and took a deep breath. This is it, he thought. His kids ran along the sidewalk while Clara, his wife, inspected every detail with a sharp eye. The move was more than just physical. It was a fresh start for the family, in a neighborhood where they knew acceptance wouldn't come easily. But with hope in their hearts and determination in their eyes, the Browns were ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they began unloading the first boxes, Clara noticed the neighborhood wasn't as welcoming as she had hoped. Some curious stares, others cold and distant. James stood firm, aware that his new position as police chief would be a crucial factor in this community, but also a potential source of tension. He knew living here would bring difficult moments, yet he also saw an opportunity to break barriers and show they were here to contribute, not divide. Clara, on the other hand, understood that adapting would require patience and courage. As days passed, the Browns focused on settling into their home and learning more about the neighborhood. James observed the environment with the cautious eye of someone who had seen the complexities of human nature up close, but also with a desire to be part of this community. He knew they would face resistance, but he remained hopeful that, in time, they could build genuine connections. Clara, ever mindful, noticed the neighborhood had an air of distance, something that could only be broken with acts of empathy and openness. The Brown children, unaware of the adult tensions, played carefreely in the yard, while James and Clara quietly wondered what the future held for them there. They had faced many battles in their lives, and this would be no different. The feeling of being outsiders, watched and judged, weighed heavily on them, but they remained steadfast, determined to overcome the challenges. Each new day was an attempt to integrate, whether it was by greeting neighbors or simply showing they were open to building bridges. It was clear that, while there were invisible walls, there was also an opportunity to create lasting connections. Clara, knowing that connection would be the key to breaking the ice, suggested they start getting more involved. "Maybe we should organize something here at home, a dinner or a barbecue," she said to James, who quickly agreed. He understood that a simple gesture like that could be the first step to opening hearts and breaking down the walls they felt growing around them. But Clara also knew not everyone would be ready for this kind of interaction. Nevertheless, it was a risk they were willing to take, hopeful that they could, little by little, shift the neighborhood's dynamics. What troubled Clara the most was the distant attitude of some neighbors, especially one in particular, Mrs. Smith, who from day one had made her disapproval of the Browns clear. Every time Clara crossed paths with her, she received nothing but a cold stare. "I don't think she likes us," she commented to James, who, as always, treated the situation calmly. "Let's give it time," he replied, trying to ease his wife's concerns. James knew his position as police chief might provoke negative reactions, but he trusted that their actions would eventually speak louder than any prejudice. As they continued to adjust, the Browns refused to let the initial difficulties dampen their spirits. Clara, determined to create an atmosphere of love and unity, focused on making their new house a true home, despite the external tensions. She understood that the key to overcoming any challenge was to remain calm and continue believing that in time things would start to fall into place. James, on the other hand, concentrated on his new role, fully aware that his leadership would be closely watched by the entire community. Weeks went by, and the Browns began to feel a little more comfortable in their new surroundings, though the social and cultural barriers remained evident. "There's still a lot we need to overcome," Clara said one night during dinner with the family. "But I'm willing to keep trying." James, ever the steady presence, responded, "It's going to take time, but we'll get there." For them, the key to everything was staying true to their values, refusing to let external pressures force them to compromise. And so, day by day, they built a new reality, one step at a time. The challenges of adjusting were real, but the Browns refused to let discouragement take hold. Clara, with her heart full of love for her children and for James, knew the greatest lesson they could give to the community was the strength of their unity. "We're going to keep being who we are," she told James. He agreed, knowing that the example they set would resonate far beyond the confines of their street. For the Browns, the most important thing was to keep moving forward with dignity, trusting that time and the right actions would bring about the change they hoped for. As time passed, the Browns began to notice small changes in some of the neighbors' attitudes. While full acceptance was still far off, small gestures of courtesy began to emerge. James saw this as a positive sign, but he knew that true change would take time. Clara, always observant, remained concerned about Mrs. Smith's coldness, but she didn't let it get to her. The Browns were here to stay, and they were determined to fight for their inclusion, not just for themselves, but for everyone who faced the same struggles. James knew that as police chief, his presence in the neighborhood carried symbolic weight. It wasn't just about authority, but also about setting an example. He knew his actions would be scrutinized, and his family was on the front lines of this new chapter in their lives. Clara saw it as an opportunity for learning, not just for their children, but for themselves. "We're all learning," she would say. And so, with each new day, the Brown family continued to move forward, facing each obstacle with courage, hoping that love and respect would ultimately prevail. From the very first day, Mrs. Smith made her feelings clear. She watched the Brown family with a scowl as they unloaded their belongings, her posture stiff with disapproval. Whenever Clara or James waved at her from across the street, she turned away without acknowledgement. Mrs. Smith's hostility wasn't subtle, it was deliberate and cold. The Browns had hoped for a warmer welcome, or at least basic neighborly courtesy. But it was clear that Mrs. Smith had already decided they didn't belong. It was an unspoken tension that hung in the air, and Clara couldn't help but wonder why the woman was so unwilling to give them a chance. Clara tried not to take Mrs. Smith's coldness personally, but it wasn't easy. Every time she saw the older woman, whether tending to her garden or leaving her house, the same dismissive look greeted her. Clara's attempts at friendliness were met with silence. Maybe she's just set in her ways, Clara told herself, trying to brush it off. But deep down it stung. She was a firm believer in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but Mrs. Smith seemed to be determined to make them feel like outsiders. Clara shared her frustrations with James, who reminded her to stay patient. "People like that take time," he said. James, for his part, handled the situation with his usual calm demeanor. As the new police chief, he was used to dealing with difficult people, and he approached Mrs. Smith no differently. Whenever they crossed paths, he would greet her politely, even though she never responded. James believed that persistence and professionalism would eventually break through her frosty exterior. "You can't change someone overnight," he often reminded Clara. But even he was beginning to feel the strain of Mrs. Smith's constant coldness. Her behavior wasn't just a personal slight. It was starting to affect the way the entire neighborhood interacted with the Browns. The tension Mrs. Smith created seemed to ripple through the neighborhood. Other neighbors, who were once hesitant but polite, started taking cues from her behavior. Conversations that once seemed possible now felt awkward. People who had exchanged pleasantries with Clara at the grocery store or waved at James from their front porches began to act more distant. It was as if Mrs. Smith's disapproval was contagious, spreading across the community like a silent, invisible force. Clara could feel the isolation growing, and it weighed heavily on her. Why is she so determined to make us feel unwelcome? Clara often wondered. Despite the growing tension, Clara refused to let Mrs. Smith dictate her family's experience in the neighborhood. She knew they had to push through, to show strength and resilience. But it wasn't just about putting on a brave face. It was about making genuine connections, even if some doors remained closed. One afternoon, Clara decided to take a different approach. She baked a fresh batch of cookies and, with a hopeful smile, brought them over to Mrs. Smith's house. She knocked and waited, fully aware that the gesture might be rejected. When Mrs. Smith finally opened the door, her face remained cold. "I thought I'd bring you something sweet," Clara said warmly. Mrs. Smith looked at the cookies, then back at Clara, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Clara thought she might accept the offering, but instead, Mrs. Smith simply shook her head and closed the door without a word. Clara stood there, stunned but not defeated. She had expected resistance, but the outright rejection was harder to swallow than she'd imagined. Still, she walked back to her house, holding her head high. "I'll keep trying," she told herself. It was a small act of kindness, but Clara believed that even the hardest hearts could soften over time. She wasn't giving up, not yet. The rejection of Clara's gesture became a turning point. Rather than feeling defeated, she felt more determined than ever. James admired her strength, but he knew how much the situation was affecting her. "We'll get through this," he reassured her one evening as they sat together after putting the kids to bed. "People like Mrs. Smith have built walls around themselves for years. It'll take time, but we'll break through." Clara nodded, but the weight of Mrs. Smith's rejection still hung over her. She couldn't understand why someone would hold so much disdain for a family they barely knew. James, always pragmatic, tried to find the silver lining. "The neighborhood is watching," he said. "How we respond to her hostility matters. If we show grace, others will see that." Clara agreed, though it wasn't easy to maintain grace when faced with such blatant coldness. Still, they knew that how they handled Mrs. Smith's hostility could influence the community's perception of them, and that mattered, not just for their own sake, but for their children's future in this neighborhood. They wanted their kids to grow up in a place where they were accepted, not just tolerated. As time passed, it became clear that Mrs. Smith's hostility wasn't just a personal issue. It was part of a larger problem. Her attitude reflected a deeper resistance to change, one that had been simmering in the neighborhood long before the Browns arrived. James began to see that Mrs. Smith wasn't just reacting to them as individuals, she was reacting to the idea of them, to what they represented. A black family moving into a predominantly white neighborhood wasn't something she was ready to accept. And while Mrs. Smith's behavior was the most overt, James suspected that other neighbors shared similar feelings, even if they didn't express them as openly. Clara, meanwhile, continued to focus on the positive. She wasn't going to let one person's bitterness overshadow the small victories they were making with other neighbors. She kept baking, kept smiling, and kept waving, even when the response was cold. For Clara, it wasn't about winning Mrs. Smith over. It was about showing her children that kindness and persistence were more powerful than prejudice. She wanted to set an example for them, to teach them that even in the face of hostility, they could rise above it with grace and dignity. And so, day by day, she kept trying, even when it felt like an uphill battle. One evening, after another awkward encounter with Mrs. Smith, Clara sat with James and reflected on the situation. "Do you think she'll ever come around?" she asked. James paused, considering his response carefully. "Maybe," he said. "But even if she doesn't, we'll be okay. We'll keep showing up, being kind and living our lives. That's all we can do." Clara nodded, knowing he was right. Mrs. Smith's hostility was hurtful, but it wouldn't define their experience in the neighborhood. They had the power to shape their own story, no matter how hard Mrs. Smith tried to push them away. The Browns weren't the type to back down from a challenge, and Mrs. Smith was just that, a challenge. But they saw her as more than just an obstacle. They saw her as someone who had likely built up her own walls for years, perhaps out of fear or ignorance. And while they didn't know her full story, they knew that everyone had one. For James and Clara, this wasn't just about winning over a difficult neighbor. It was about proving to themselves and to their children that compassion and understanding were the true measures of strength. They would keep trying not because it was easy, but because it was right. After weeks of settling into their new home, James and Clara Brown decided it was time to take a bold step toward connecting with their neighbors. "We can't just sit back and wait for them to come to us," Clara said one morning over breakfast. She suggested hosting a neighborhood barbecue, an event that would allow them to break the ice and hopefully ease some of the tension that had been building. James agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to not only introduce themselves properly, but also to show that they were genuinely interested in being part of the community. It was an act of courage, and they both knew the risks involved. Planning the barbecue became a family project. The kids were excited, helping with the decorations and picking out food they thought the neighbors might like. "Do you think people will actually come?" their daughter asked, a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Clara, always the optimist, smiled and replied, "We'll see, but we're doing our part to extend the invitation." Despite her calm demeanor, even Clara wasn't sure how many neighbors would show up, especially considering Mrs. Smith's influence. Still, the Browns forged ahead, determined to create an opportunity for connection. James took it upon himself to deliver the invitations personally, stopping by each house to greet the neighbors. Some people were polite, accepting the invitation with a smile, while others hesitated or barely opened the door. "It's just a barbecue," he would say, trying to keep the mood light. "No pressure, we'd love to have you there." As he walked back home after finishing his rounds, James couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Would the event actually help break down the walls between them and the neighborhood? Or would it simply highlight how deep the divisions were? As the day of the barbecue approached, Clara focused on preparing everything to perfection. The grill was ready, the food was prepped, and the yard was set up with tables and chairs. The children, eager to make a good impression, helped set up games for the other kids in the neighborhood. "We're ready," James said, trying to project confidence, though he couldn't shake the nerves gnawing at him. Clara nodded, giving him a reassuring look. She knew how important this was, not just for them, but for their children's sense of belonging in a community that still felt foreign. The barbecue was scheduled to start in the early afternoon, and as the clock ticked closer, the Browns anxiously waited to see if anyone would show up. The first guests arrived hesitantly, an older couple from down the street who greeted Clara warmly and complimented her on the setup. Soon, more neighbors began to trickle in, though the atmosphere remained somewhat stiff. The kids, however, broke the ice first, running around the yard and playing together as if no barriers existed at all. Watching them, Clara felt a wave of hope. Perhaps this barbecue would be the first step towards something better, but not everyone was so eager to join in. Mrs. Smith, as expected, did not attend. Instead, she stood in her yard, watching from a distance with an expression of clear disapproval. Clara saw her out of the corner of her eye but chose not to let it dampen her spirits. "She'll come around eventually," Clara whispered to herself, though she wasn't entirely convinced. James, too, noticed Mrs. Smith's absence, but he focused on making the most of the guests who had shown up. He greeted each neighbor warmly, starting conversations and trying to create a relaxed and welcoming atmosphere. As the afternoon wore on, the barbecue began to feel more comfortable. People who had been hesitant at first started engaging in conversation, and the smell of grilled food mixed with laughter filled the air. James took this as a good sign, and for a moment it seemed like the Browns were finally making some headway with their neighbors. Clara circulated through the crowd, making sure everyone had enough to eat and offering drinks, while James tended to the grill, cracking jokes and sharing stories. It was beginning to feel like a genuine community event, a moment of normalcy they had been craving. However, the tension never fully disappeared. Some neighbors remained distant, avoiding deeper conversations or choosing to stand in small, isolated groups. Clara couldn't help but feel that while the event was a success on the surface, there was still a long way to go before the Browns would be truly accepted. "It's a start," she said to James when they had a moment to themselves. He nodded in agreement, though he too felt the subtle undercurrent of resistance. Even so, they both knew that creating lasting change in the neighborhood would take more than just one barbecue. As the sun began to set and the barbecue wound down, most of the guests thanked the Browns for hosting and headed home. Clara and James were left with a mix of emotions: relief that the event had gone relatively smoothly, but also uncertainty about what would happen next. "At least they came," Clara said, trying to focus on the positive. James smiled. "Yeah, it's something." But both knew that the real challenge lay in what would follow. Would the neighbors continue to engage with them, or would they retreat back into their comfort zones? Cleaning up after the barbecue, James and Clara reflected on the day's events. "We did what we could," Clara said, picking up plates and cups. "Now it's up to them." James agreed, but part of him still wondered if they'd made any real progress. The event had felt like a temporary pause in the tension, rather than a breakthrough. Still, he knew they couldn't give up after just one attempt. "We'll keep trying," he said, echoing Clara's earlier sentiment. "It's the only way we'll ever break through." Their children, oblivious to the adult tensions, declared the barbecue a success, having made a few new friends in the process. For them, the barriers that adults often built up didn't seem to exist. Clara smiled at the innocence of her kids, knowing that they were the future of the community. "If they can make friends, so can we," she said to James, who nodded, though he understood it wouldn't be quite that simple. But the hope was there, and that was enough for now. They would continue to push forward, one step at a time. The next day, as the Browns went about their daily routines, they noticed small changes in how some neighbors interacted with them. A few waved, others stopped to chat briefly. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was something. James felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the barbecue had planted seeds of connection that would grow over time. Clara, too, felt cautiously optimistic, though she knew that Mrs. Smith's influence still loomed over the neighborhood. But even Mrs. Smith couldn't stop progress forever, or so Clara hoped. And so, with the barbecue behind them, the Browns looked ahead to the next steps in their journey to integrate into the community. They knew that the road would still be difficult and that not everyone would come around easily. But for the first time, they felt like they had made a small crack in the wall of resistance. It was just the beginning, but it was enough to give them hope. Little did they know, however, that the next challenge was just around the corner, a challenge that would test their resolve in ways they hadn't expected. As the barbecue continued and the atmosphere grew more relaxed, Clara noticed Mrs. Smith standing on her porch, watching intently. Despite the casual, friendly gathering, there was something unsettling about her stare. Clara tried to shake it off, focusing instead on their guests and making sure everyone felt welcome, but it was clear Mrs. Smith wasn't content to simply observe. Moments later, Clara saw her disappear into the house, phone in hand. An uneasy feeling crept over her, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. James, busy at the grill, hadn't noticed anything yet. Not long after, the distant sound of sirens broke through the noise of laughter and conversation. At first, no one seemed to notice, but as the sirens grew louder, heads began to turn. Clara felt her stomach tighten. "What now?" she thought. The guests exchanged confused looks as two police cars pulled up in front of the Browns' home. James, sensing something was wrong, stepped away from the grill and moved toward the front yard. Clara followed, her heart racing. The once cheerful mood of the barbecue quickly shifted to one of uncertainty and tension. James kept his composure, but the situation felt like a ticking time bomb. When the officers stepped out of their cars, the crowd fell silent. It didn't take long for Clara to connect the dots. She glanced over at Mrs. Smith's house and saw her peeking through her curtains. It was clear who had made the call. "She couldn't just leave us in peace, could she?" Clara whispered to James. James took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and approached the officers calmly. "Evening, officers, is there a problem?" he asked, maintaining a respectful tone, though the tension in the air was palpable. The guests watched in a mix of confusion and concern. The officers looked around, taking in the scene of the barbecue. One of them cleared his throat before speaking. "We received a noise complaint about a disturbance in the neighborhood," he said, clearly uncomfortable. James exchanged a glance with Clara. A noise complaint? That didn't make sense. The barbecue had been lively, but nothing out of the ordinary for a neighborhood gathering. It was clear to both James and Clara that this was no simple complaint. It was Mrs. Smith's latest attempt to disrupt their lives. James remained calm, though the situation was growing more tense by the second. What the officers didn't seem to realize, at least not immediately, was that James wasn't just any neighbor. He was their new police chief. As one of the officers scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on James, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Wait a minute," he muttered, taking a step closer. "Chief Brown?" James nodded, his expression calm but firm. The officer's posture changed instantly, shifting from authoritative to apologetic. "I didn't realize this was your house, sir," he said, now visibly uncomfortable. The realization hit hard, and the tension in the air took on a new form, one of embarrassment and confusion. The other officer, now understanding the situation, quickly backed down as well. "We're really sorry, Chief. We didn't mean to—" he started, but James cut him off with a raised hand. "No harm done, officers." "I understand you're just doing your job," he said, his voice steady but authoritative. He glanced toward Mrs. Smith's house once more, knowing full well she was behind the complaint. The officers, clearly eager to leave, apologized again before heading back to their cars. As the patrol cars drove away, the neighborhood was left in an awkward silence. James turned back to the guests, trying to ease the tension. "All right, folks, looks like the barbecue's back on," he said, attempting to bring some lightness back to the moment. But the mood had shifted. The once lively barbecue now felt weighed down by the incident. Guests whispered among themselves, still processing what had just happened. Clara, though relieved that things hadn't escalated further, couldn't shake the frustration she felt. Mrs. Smith had crossed a line, and the whole neighborhood had seen it. "She really did that," Clara muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. James, ever the diplomat, tried to stay positive. "It's over now," he said softly. But they both knew that this was far from the end. Mrs. Smith's actions had sent a clear message, one that couldn't be ignored. As the evening wore on, a few of the neighbors came over to express their support. "I can't believe she called the cops," one of the guests said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You guys were just having a barbecue like anyone else." James and Clara appreciated the words of encouragement, but they also knew that many of the neighbors had stayed silent throughout the ordeal. The barbecue had revealed the division within the community in a way that could no longer be denied. Mrs. Smith wasn't the only one uncomfortable with the Browns' presence. She had just been the boldest. Clara couldn't help but wonder what impact the incident would have on their efforts to build relationships in the neighborhood. They had hoped the barbecue would be a step toward unity, but now it felt like a setback. "What if this makes things worse?" she asked James later that evening as they cleaned up. James, still calm, shook his head. "It's out in the open now," he said. "People know who she is and what she's about. If anything, this might help us more than hurt us." Clara wasn't so sure, but she trusted James's instincts. They had weathered storms before. This would just be another challenge to overcome. The next day, word about the police incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some people expressed their outrage at Mrs. Smith's actions, while others stayed quiet, not wanting to get involved. It became clear that while some neighbors supported the Browns, others were still hesitant to embrace them fully. Clara felt a mix of emotions, grateful for the support, but disheartened by the silence of others. James, as always, kept a level head. "We're making progress, even if it's slow," he reminded her, but Clara couldn't help but feel like they were fighting an uphill battle. Despite the tension, James decided it was time to take control of the situation. He arranged a meeting with the local neighborhood association to address the incident and to discuss broader issues of inclusion and community relations. "We need to get everything out in the open," he said to Clara as they prepared for the meeting. "People need to talk about what happened, about what's really going on here." Clara agreed, though she knew it wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Smith had stirred the pot, and now the entire neighborhood would have to face the consequences. As they prepared for the meeting, Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of determination. The barbecue might not have gone as planned, but it had exposed the real challenges they were facing. Now it was time to confront them head-on. James, ever the leader, was ready to guide the conversation, but he knew this wouldn't be resolved in one meeting. "This is just the beginning," he said to Clara, and she knew he was right. They had come too far to back down now. The barbecue had been the spark, but the real work was just beginning. In the days following the barbecue incident, James wasted no time in organizing a neighborhood meeting. He knew the tension couldn't be left to simmer any longer. It was time to confront it head-on. Clara was by his side as they prepared for the gathering, helping him craft a message that would be both firm and inviting. "This isn't just about us," James said as they went over his notes. "It's about this community and how we move forward together." Clara nodded in agreement. They both understood the importance of this moment, not just for their family, but for the future of the entire neighborhood. The meeting was held at a local community center, a neutral space where everyone could feel comfortable. As neighbors filed in, James stood at the front, greeting each one with a smile. Some seemed hesitant, unsure of what to expect, while others came in with an air of support, eager to see how the discussion would unfold. Mrs. Smith, as expected, was absent, but her influence lingered. James wasn't surprised by her absence. It only underscored the importance of addressing the issues that had been festering beneath the surface. "We can't ignore what's been happening," he thought. Once everyone was seated, James opened the meeting with a calm but firm tone. "Thank you all for coming," he began, scanning the room. What happened at the barbecue wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a symptom of something deeper. He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're new to this neighborhood, but it's clear that there are issues here that go beyond just us. Tonight, I want to talk openly about those issues. This is a chance for us to move forward together." The room was silent for a moment, and then a few nods of agreement rippled through the crowd. It was a start. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that many of the neighbors had been feeling the same underlying tension. Some admitted that they had been unsure how to approach the Browns, not because of any ill will, but because they didn't know how to bridge the cultural gap. "It's not that we don't want to be welcoming," one neighbor said. "It's just that we've never had to face these kinds of differences before." James listened carefully, nodding as the man spoke. "That's exactly why we're here," he replied, "so we can start bridging those gaps instead of letting them divide us." The turning point came when a woman in the back of the room, who had remained quiet until then, raised her hand. "I was at the barbecue," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "And I was shocked when the police showed up. It didn't seem right." She paused, looking around the room. "I think what happened that day was wrong, and it made me realize that we need to do better. We need to start seeing each other as neighbors, not as strangers." Her words resonated with many in the room, and several people nodded in agreement. It was an unexpected moment of vulnerability, and it opened the door for others to share their thoughts. As more neighbors spoke up, the conversation shifted from tension to solutions. People began offering ideas for how the community could come together, suggestions for block parties, volunteer projects, and shared spaces where neighbors could interact more naturally. Clara, listening from the back of the room, felt a sense of relief. The ice was finally beginning to break. The discussion wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements and uncomfortable moments, but the fact that people were talking openly was a huge step forward. James had created a space where the community could start healing, and that was more than they could have hoped for. At one point, a man who had been sitting quietly near the front raised his hand. "I think it's about time we all acknowledge something," he said, looking around the room. What happened with Mrs. Smith wasn't just about a noise complaint, it was about fear. Fear of change, fear of the unknown. But we can't let that kind of fear define our community. His words struck a chord with many in the room. James nodded in agreement. "Fear only has power if we let it," he said. "And I believe we're better than that. We have a chance to set an example, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come." As the meeting drew to a close, James took a moment to address the group once more. What happened at the barbecue was just one event, but it doesn't have to define our neighborhood. We've got a long road ahead, but I believe we can make this a place where everyone feels like they belong. The room was silent for a moment, and then slowly, people began to clap. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was a sign that they were ready to move forward. Clara, watching from the back, felt a wave of emotion. This was the beginning of something new, a chance for their family to truly be part of the community. After the meeting, several neighbors approached James and Clara, thanking them for organizing the event and for addressing the issues so directly. One woman even admitted that she had been nervous about attending, but was glad she did. "I didn't know what to expect," she said, "but I'm glad we had this conversation. It feels like a weight has been lifted." James and Clara exchanged a look of relief. It wasn't going to be easy, but they had taken the first step toward building something real with their neighbors. The road to change had started, and there was no turning back now. As they walked home that night, James and Clara reflected on how far they had come since moving into the neighborhood. "It's not perfect," Clara said, "but it's progress." James nodded, his mind still on the future. "We've got to keep moving forward," he replied. "This is just the beginning." They both knew that the work was far from over, but for the first time since moving in, they felt like they had a real chance at building a community where they could thrive. It was an unexpected turnaround, and it filled them with hope. The next few days brought small but noticeable changes in the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once been distant now waved or stopped for brief chats. There was still a long way to go, but the atmosphere had shifted. Even Clara noticed that Mrs. Smith, though still unfriendly, no longer watched them with the same intensity. "Maybe she's realized her tactics won't work," Clara thought to herself. It was a small victory, but it felt like the community was beginning to embrace the Browns in ways they hadn't expected. As the Browns settled into this new phase of their life in the neighborhood, they remained committed to building bridges and fostering relationships. James, ever the leader, knew that more challenges would come, but he was prepared. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he often reminded Clara. But they were seeing the first signs of it, signs that with enough perseverance and a willingness to engage, even the hardest walls could start to crumble. The unexpected turnaround at the meeting had given them a renewed sense of purpose, and they were ready to keep pushing forward. With the neighborhood meeting behind them and a sense of cautious optimism in the air, the Browns began to look toward the future. There would be more moments of difficulty, but they had built a foundation of trust and dialogue that would carry them through. Now, even Mrs. Smith, the once hostile neighbor, was showing signs of softening, though her full transformation was still to come. Little did they know her change of heart would be one of the most surprising outcomes yet. After the barbecue incident and the community meeting organized by James Brown, something began to change in the neighborhood. The positive impact wasn't just due to the police being called, but because of how James and Clara handled the situation with dignity and calm. Many people who had been hesitant about the Browns began to reconsider their opinions. The meeting had opened up discussions that seemed impossible before. The neighborhood, which once felt distant and divided, started to realize that prejudice could be overcome through dialogue and empathy. Determined to maintain the momentum, James continued to organize small gatherings with the neighbors. He knew that real transformation wouldn't come from just one moment, but from continuous effort. In each meeting, more people began to open up, sharing their experiences and listening more carefully. Slowly, the neighborhood started to come together around a bigger cause, building a place where everyone felt included and respected, regardless of their background or skin color. It was a subtle change, but Clara and James knew they were on the right path. The Brown children, who initially felt somewhat out of place, began making new friends. The kids, without the same prejudices as the adults, integrated quickly. It was one of the first signs that real change was happening. While the adults were still learning how to deal with their differences, the children were already playing together, unaware of the tensions that had once existed. Watching this, Clara felt a wave of hope. If the younger generation could overcome these barriers, the adults could too, even if it would be a slower and more complex process. The most visible transformation, however, was the growing involvement of the residents in community activities. More people began attending the meetings, local events became more inclusive, and even those who had kept their distance, like Mrs. Smith, started to show up. James and Clara knew progress was being made when neighbors not only attended, but also started proposing their own ideas to improve relationships in the neighborhood. It was as if a new energy had been injected into the area, an energy of cooperation and inclusion. Over time, the very dynamics of the neighborhood began to change. Mrs. Smith, who had once been a symbol of resistance to change, started actively participating in the meetings and even suggested forming a committee to discuss ways to promote inclusion and diversity. For James and Clara, seeing this transformation felt almost unbelievable. One night, Clara told James, "If Mrs. Smith can change, anyone can." James smiled, sharing the same hope. The personal transformation of one of the most resistant figures in the community was a powerful symbol of the impact they were having. The positive impact also began to reflect in how the residents interacted with one another. Where there had once been distrust and silence, now there were open conversations. Discussions about inclusion, respect, and understanding became a regular part of the neighborhood's daily life. Even those who remained skeptical began to see that unity and respect brought real benefits. The neighborhood was becoming a better place for everyone, largely thanks to the patience and perseverance of the Browns. James was not only the police chief, but a community leader. As the months passed, what once seemed like a divided neighborhood now showed clear signs of unity. The positive impact was evident not only in daily interactions, but in the atmosphere itself. Clara, ever observant, noticed how neighbors who once avoided the family now greeted them with genuine smiles. Small gestures of cordiality, which had initially seemed forced, now came naturally. And James, despite the heavy responsibilities of his job, made sure to maintain an active presence in community activities, always reinforcing the importance of inclusion. The change was also felt in how the neighborhood events now included everyone. Festivities that had once drawn a specific, limited group now embraced the full diversity of the community. The first major event organized after the barbecue was a resounding success. Families from different backgrounds gathered to celebrate the community they were building together. Clara, watching from a distance, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "This is what we always wanted," she said to James, who couldn't have been prouder of the progress they were making. But not everything was easy. There were moments of resistance, where old prejudices tried to resurface. However, there was now a collective force that wouldn't allow those feelings to dominate the neighborhood again. James and Clara's leadership, along with the support of new allies, ensured that no significant setbacks occurred. The community meetings became a safe space to discuss these issues openly, and more than anything else, this kept the neighborhood united. The Browns' perseverance in promoting dialogue and understanding made all the difference. One of the greatest victories, however, was seeing the transformation of people like Mrs. Smith. Her active participation in neighborhood activities and her involvement in inclusion discussions didn't go unnoticed. "I never thought I'd say this, but Mrs. Smith is an ally now," one of the neighbors said to Clara during a meeting. Clara smiled and replied, "That's what it means to grow together." The impact the Brown family had on everyone around them was undeniable, and Mrs. Smith's change was living proof of that. As the Browns continued to play a vital role in the transformation of the community, the message of inclusion and respect began to spread beyond the neighborhood. The positive impact of their actions was being discussed in other parts of the city, and the story of the neighborhood that overcame its divisions became an example to follow. For James and Clara, it was more than they could have imagined when they first moved in. What started as a personal attempt to integrate had turned into a social movement, impacting many lives. James and Clara knew that, despite all the progress, the work was not yet finished. Real, lasting change takes time and continuous effort. However, the impact they had already made was undeniable, and they continued to inspire those around them. The neighborhood, once divided by invisible lines of prejudice and fear, was now becoming a living example of how compassion, forgiveness, and determination could transform even the hardest of hearts. Clara and James continued to believe that, with perseverance, any challenge could be overcome. Now, with the neighborhood more united than ever, the Browns finally felt at home. The community's transformation was a reflection of the power that small acts of kindness and empathy can have. The positive impact they started was growing like a wave, and the change they had planted was now flourishing in every corner. The children grew up in a more inclusive environment, neighbors shared more of their lives, and even Mrs. Smith, the figure who once represented resistance, was now a symbol of how anyone can change. It was a new era for the community, and the Browns were at the heart of it. It started with small gestures, nothing drastic, but enough for Clara to notice a shift. Mrs. Smith, once so rigid and unapproachable, had begun to change. At first it was subtle, a quick nod of acknowledgement when their paths crossed, or a lingering glance that seemed less judgmental than before. Clara wasn't sure what had caused the shift, but she sensed that the neighborhood meeting had planted a seed. Mrs. Smith didn't attend, but perhaps hearing about the conversations and the support for the Browns had made her reconsider her stance. Whatever the reason, Clara could feel that something was different. James, ever the observer, noticed it too. "She's not glaring at us like she used to," he remarked one evening as they sat on the porch. Clara smiled slightly. "Progress," she said. But they both knew that the real test would be if Mrs. Smith could move beyond her coldness and actually engage with them. It wasn't about forcing a friendship, but about opening the door to the possibility of change. Clara believed that deep down, people were capable of growth, even if they didn't show it right away. And Mrs. Smith, despite her outward hostility, was no different. One day, as Clara was tending to her garden, she noticed Mrs. Smith out in her yard, pruning her roses. Normally, the two women would have ignored each other, but today was different. Mrs. Smith hesitated, looking over at Clara as if she were debating whether to say something. Clara, always the one to extend the olive branch, decided to break the ice. "Your roses are beautiful," she said with a warm smile. Mrs. Smith looked startled, but instead of brushing it off like she usually did, she gave a brief nod. "Thank you," she muttered, her voice barely audible. It was a small step, but it was something. As the weeks went by, these small interactions continued. Mrs. Smith still wasn't warm, but she had softened. Clara noticed that she would occasionally wave or give a curt greeting, and while it wasn't much, it was far better than the cold shoulder they had been used to. The children, always less affected by adult tensions, didn't seem to notice the change, but Clara and James appreciated it. "She's coming around," James remarked one evening. "Slowly, but she is." Clara nodded, feeling hopeful. It was a reminder that even the hardest hearts could soften with time. Then came a turning point that neither Clara nor James could have predicted. One afternoon, as Clara was bringing groceries into the house, Mrs. Smith approached her. It was the first time she had ever voluntarily walked over to speak. "Do you need help with those?" she asked, her voice a bit stiff, but genuine. Clara, taken aback, smiled and handed her a bag. "That would be great, thanks," she replied. They carried the groceries into the house together in silence, but the air between them felt different. There was no tension, just an understanding that something was changing between them. After helping Clara with the groceries, Mrs. Smith lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say more. Clara waited patiently, sensing that this was an important moment. Finally, Mrs. Smith spoke. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, she said, her voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "I've seen a lot of changes, and I haven't always liked them." She paused, looking out the window. "But I don't want to be the kind of person who drives good people away." Clara, touched by her honesty, nodded. "Change is hard," she said gently, "but we're all learning." That conversation marked a turning point. Mrs. Smith didn't transform overnight, but the walls she had built around herself were slowly coming down. She began stopping by more often, sometimes just to chat about small things. Her garden, the weather, local news. It wasn't a deep friendship, but it was the start of something new. Clara and James welcomed these moments, seeing them as proof that people could change, even when it seemed impossible. Mrs. Smith was beginning to realize that the Browns weren't a threat. They were her neighbors, just like anyone else. Over time, Mrs. Smith's interactions with the Browns became more frequent and less awkward. She even began waving at James when he left for work in the mornings, a far cry from the cold glares she used to give him. Clara noticed that Mrs. Smith was becoming more involved in neighborhood activities as well, attending events that she once would have avoided. It was clear that her heart was softening, and that the fear and prejudice she had clung to for so long were starting to fade. The transformation was slow, but it was real. One day, Mrs. Smith surprised everyone by showing up to one of the neighborhood block parties organized by the Browns. It was the first time she had ever willingly participated in a community event with them. Clara greeted her warmly, offering her a seat at the table. "I didn't expect to see you here," Clara said with a smile. Mrs. Smith shrugged, her usual defensiveness gone. "I figured it was about time," she said simply. It was a small admission, but it spoke volumes. Mrs. Smith was no longer the distant, hostile figure she had once been. She was becoming part of the community. As the block party continued, Mrs. Smith even began chatting with some of the other neighbors, many of whom were surprised by her sudden change of heart. James, watching from the grill, couldn't help but smile. "She's really doing it," he whispered to Clara. "I didn't think I'd see the day." Clara nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the moment they had been hoping for, a sign that all their efforts to build bridges were paying off. Mrs. Smith's change of heart wasn't just about her. It was about the entire community coming together. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Smith continued to make strides in her relationship with the Browns. She even stopped by one day to drop off a homemade pie, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. Clara accepted it with gratitude, knowing that this simple act was a symbol of how far they had all come. Mrs. Smith, once the face of hostility in the neighborhood, was now becoming a friend. "I never thought I'd see the day," James said again, shaking his head in disbelief. But Clara knew that deep down, they had always hoped for this outcome. The transformation of Mrs. Smith had a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. Other neighbors, seeing her change, began to engage more with the Browns as well. The barriers that once seemed so solid were crumbling, replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. Clara and James had always believed that kindness and perseverance could change hearts, and now they were seeing the proof. Mrs. Smith's change wasn't just a personal victory, it was a victory for the entire neighborhood, a sign that people could overcome their fears and prejudices if they were willing to try. As Mrs. Smith's relationship with the Browns deepened, she began to reflect on her own actions. One afternoon, while sitting with Clara on the porch, she admitted something that surprised them both. "I've spent so many years keeping people at a distance because I was afraid of change," she said quietly. "But you've shown me that change doesn't have to be bad. It can be good." Clara smiled, her heart full. "We're all learning," she said. And with that, the final walls between them came down, leaving only the possibility of a brighter, more unified future. With Mrs. Smith's transformation complete, the Browns could finally feel like they had found their place in the neighborhood. They had faced resistance, hostility, and challenges, but through perseverance and kindness, they had built something lasting. Mrs. Smith's journey from hostility to friendship was a testament to the power of compassion, and it left the Browns feeling hopeful for the future. Now, the neighborhood felt like home, and the Browns knew that they had not only changed Mrs. Smith, they had helped transform the entire community. So after everything you've just seen, I have to ask, how would you handle a situation like this? What would you do if your own neighbor tried to bring you down, but you had the chance to turn it into something powerful? The truth is, conflict and prejudice are everywhere, but it's how we choose to respond that defines us. This story shows us that even the most hostile environments can change when one person leads with grace, determination, and a vision for something greater. But now it's your turn. Are you ready to take the lessons from this story and apply them in your own life? Whether it's overcoming obstacles at work, navigating difficult relationships, or standing strong in your values, how will you rise above and inspire those around you? Drop a comment below and tell me how you would handle a situation like this. I want to hear your thoughts, and if you want more stories like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss a single video that could help you change your perspective and inspire your next big move. Thanks for watching, and remember, change starts with each of us. Let's keep growing together.